I think there's something more fundamental here than just simply the quantity and the quality. I mean, the quality of the relationships is really what you're talking about, but more fundamental than the quality, or sorry, the quantity of relationships or the way in which they're supported throughout the community, which is sort of the psychological angle to it. Um, and that is to say that in developmental psychology, when we think about attachment patterns in children, what we're actually talking about is the way in which the child relates themselves to the outside world, broadly speaking. There's always an object of attachment, even in the case of a caregiver scenario. The way that that's sort of conceptualized is a subject object relationship. Now, of course, a mature attachment style recognizes that there's, that it's not an object, that what you've encountered is a secondary subject. Um, that being said, when we're talking about things like cooperation or fear response, or even just the basic I'm sorry, not access, axis of
Mhm.
uh, of exploration versus, let's say, a non-exploratory or a fear-based mentality. Um, all of that is built into sort of the attachment styles that a child develops, usually very, very early on, like within the first 7 years of life.
Mhm.
And if something goes wrong during those stages, it can become very difficult to then pull them out of that, even if they get proper support uh, later on, because of how deeply that's ingrained in their conception of self and their conception of others. And so this is one of those key areas that can really be a massive point of improvement in preventing those kinds of things from happening. Because when you look at, say, things like aggression, or you look at uncooperative behavior, um, all these things that we sort of view as antisocial, a lot of those are grounded in a sort of dysfunctional attachment style, which gets developed, unfortunately, very early on, when there's very minimal control by the child themselves over how these things play out.
Mm.
Um, so I wanted to then ask you, like, do you imagine things like psychological services, or uh, kinds of widespread interventions on the level of not only traditional psychotherapy methods, but also things like physical engagement, like getting people, and in particular children, again, more physically embodied, and different kinds of alternative methods, things like meditation, for example. Would these be all sort of involved in the kind of planning or the formation of this educational curriculum that you are imagining would go along with this sort of rearrangement of society?
Oh, cool. Well, when I imagine the rearrangement of society, I kind of stop at imagining, at trying to set a good foundation for then society to go forth and do its own thing. And within that, I've got all sorts of my own ideas about like what the optimum thing would be. But I think it's very important. Well, I want to make it very, very clear that with the Global Redesign Institute, what that means for me and Dymaxsyn, my idea, like what I'm trying to do, is just to give humanity um, a, a good jumping off point to then figure stuff out for themselves. Well, for itself, for people to figure stuff out for themselves. Um, and then sort of let the chips fall where they may, because I think the end is pre-existent in the means. And if you want to have that's a Martin Luther King quote, if you want to have a situation, a future in which there is a high degree of liberty, it needs to arise. It needs to arise as freely as possible. So that's just my little disclaimer. Okay, now but what was the word that you said? It wasn't a syllabus, but you used a similar kind of word
It's a
just there, like
syllabus.
not a
Uh,
syllabus, but you're like a curriculum,
oh, okay.
right? I don't know if that's a similar word, but I associate the two. So yeah, and you were saying about, I think absolutely, yeah, like a meditation, yoga, and connection with nature should all be, very uh should all factor in very greatly in in a child's development. Absolutely. Yeah, of course. And, the degree to which that needs to happen would be specific to each and every child, but certainly, it's my personal dream to open up a school one day. I'm a couple of qualifications away from doing that, but I'm on my way to having all of those qualifications to then not be able to do it because I can't afford it. No, sorry, that's negative self-talk. The dream is there. And the dream is that I'd open up my own school and it would be like half just like regular school, right? So like, just like a creche. Sorry, like a preschool. It would probably be a preschool. And then you'd have but it'd also be a rescue farm, and like lessons would be outdoors as much as possible. You'd have like like lesson time allocated to just freestyling out in the nature, getting your hands dirty, seeing what you wanted to come up with, but always with um a general kind of support from the facilitators. It wouldn't just because children, there's some, I can't reference the study now, but there have been studies done in which it showed that children, when becoming bored, they revert to sadistic aggression. So I know I'm not talking about just all like sending the kids out into a field and be like, see you later, kids, enjoy being free. Because I think that can be very problematic, not least because of that idea of peer orientation. In order to develop secure and functional attachment styles, a very important thing which is needed for that is guidance. So whereas when it comes to learning how to paint a picture, or learning how to I don't know, how to write, or even developing a relationship with maths and numbers, in science, it's very important to kind of you know like allow the child to make that discovery process there, so they can have all of that positive creative association with it, and then in that way really do justice to the genius that we're all imbued with as children, that willingness to try doing things differently. I haven't met a single child in my whole experience of working with children. I've never met a single child who was not in some way a creative genius, just by virtue of wanting to experiment and do things a little bit differently and getting all weird and silly with it, right? um, but when it comes to the development of attachment style, how we communicate with each other, it's very important that there is uh, a like a wise, empathetic, non-violent, in the sense of like force of truth. Obviously, it goes without saying we don't want to be hitting our kids, but more than that, we want to be coming at them with respect. We want to be tailoring our communication specifically to meet the needs of the individual in question, so that they feel seen and understood and listened to and appreciated. And we, as caregivers, want to be showcasing all of these different ways of interacting respectfully and of being being functionally and supporting functional attachment, so that then the children can, first of all, form a bond with us because we're so nice and they like us so much. And then also, what's the word, which isn't assimilate and isn't copy, emulate. Emulate our behaviors, because children who have kind of been left to their own devices amongst their peers a little bit too much and become peer oriented are more likely, I can't reference the study, but there is one, and I think you can find it if you go to, I think, the psychologist Gordon Neufeld's website, or maybe even Dr. Gabor Mate has done some stuff about this as well. Children who are more peer oriented are much more likely to then in later life, adolescence, and in adulthood, seek out primarily more primitive forms of attachment. So they're going to be trying to attach to the people they care about, sexually and through validation. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but they're going to be doing that more than trying to form an intellectual and emotional bond with that person. Because again, they're kind of locked in that immature feedback loop, right? And so definitely having a type of community in which education is kind of facilitated. Academic education is like facilitated. Creative education is like an exploratory process with the support, with the attentive but also respectful support of adults, and where emotional development and attachment styles is something that children are guided through, would greatly reduce, I feel, is pretty fair to say, would greatly reduce the likelihood of dysfunctional attachment styles in later life.